Okay, so welcome to this Living Bridges conversation. This conversation is part of a series of conversations we're having with practitioners of nonviolent communication and other empathy-related modalities, as well as people from the social sector. And this is to um, raise awareness and to have more discussions around the role of empathy and collaboration in the social sector directly. And it's also to raise awareness around the fact that Living Bridges is having a fundraiser and we would really like you to contribute some money. So that's a shameless request right at the beginning, and I'll do a more formal request at the end. And we're joined today by Kerry Buckmaster, who is a community trainer, a mediator, and a writer. And she's a certified trainer with the Center for Nonviolent Communication. And I'm really excited, particularly because Kerry's work is heavily focused on transforming conflict. And I think one of the things that I'm very thrilled about is this word that shows up so often in your profile, which is about accompanying one another and sharing in the grief and loss and trauma that we all hold. So thank you for being here and welcome.
Great to be here. Asking me.
Yeah. And I'm gonna maybe just begin at the very beginning. I'd like to ask you to speak a little bit about yourself. And I know you've been involved in grassroots work, and I know that you're involved with NVC and conflict, but what brought you to where you are at the moment and what inspired you to do this work?
Thank you. Yeah, and hearing you name that word accompaniment, which has become really important to me, particularly over the last sort of 5 or 6 years. And it's really after encountering Sarah Payton's work around accompaniment, empathic accompaniment, that's when everything kind of landed in me. And I kind of felt incredibly empowered that this is how, change happens, by accompanying each other through difficult moments. And it happened, although I encountered NVC, before that, I suffered a really significant bereavement in 2014. And after that point, I was really sort of dedicating myself to my work, social change work, accompanying others as well as myself through grief, through conflict. That's when it all kind of, I don't know, I had a greater sense of purpose and clarity about what I needed to be doing. So it's really nice of hearing you start with the word accompaniment, because that feels like it's at the core of being together through difficult things. And I have chosen to work a lot around conflict. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but supporting ourselves through conflict and accompanying each other through conflict. Not easy.
No.
It's not easy.
Not at all. Yeah.
But it's better than the opposite. It's better than the distance that happens through conflict, the distance, the disconnection, and the loss, So even though walking together through conflict is really painful, it's better than the opposite. It's better than the disconnection.
Which is when we separate because of conflict, or when we don't know how to walk with one another. I want to just capture something I just heard you say, which is resonating really deeply with me, is social change happens when we start to accompany one another in these difficult experiences. And I'm feeling really moved by that. You're a founding member of the Conflict Transformation Weave in the NVC network in UK. I'd love to hear a bit more about that, and maybe also exploring a little bit around the value of communication and empathy in conflict transformation work. Would you be willing to share?
Yeah. So we founded the Conflict Transformation Weave in 2016, which coincided with all of the work around the New Futures process. And that's why we were initially called a weave, because that was the term in the New Futures process. Basically a group, if you're not familiar with that word. And we formed because we were witnessing kind of conflicts in the NVC network, which weren't being accompanied, which weren't being held. And it left the network kind of disconnected, connected in parts, disconnected in others. And it just felt like a bit of an important step to do, that we actually create structures around this. Yeah. Because what happens when conflicts happen, if there's no structures, then we kind of revert. NVC doesn't save the day when there is conflict. hate to say that, but it doesn't. It's, you know, we need those structures to kind of lean into when we're triggered. So and it's also come at a time that the MVC community in the UK is trying to organise more. So there is now an organisation being formed. So we've renamed as the Conflict Transformation Circle within MVC UK.
Right.
And have learnt a lot over the last 6 years about how to communicate what we're doing. That's one thing, how to do it, but then how to communicate what we're doing, and how to you asked about communication and empathy in the work, because even in an MVC network, when conflict happens, we still fall into those inherited beliefs around conflict, that we are on trial, that we are going to be punished. We still do. So because of that realization and understanding, we realize that there's so much more. We've got our system in place, it's operational, and we need to spend a lot more time on the preemptive work. So what we've been doing is having community conversations and study groups, things like that, around the areas where conflict does come up. And it's around areas around exclusion, oppression, marginalization. This is the areas. So we're having community conversations around whiteness. We want to have one about class, around power and privilege, neurodivergence, all the things where some people experience exclusion or marginalization. Some people experience lack of understanding, blind spots. There's hurt. So we're currently spending quite a lot more time on the preemptive work and actually putting things on the table, so we build more relationships with each other. So that when the conflict comes, we're already more prepared because something's been put on the table. It's a very loud motorbike that's just gone past.
That's okay. I want to capture a couple of things that I'm hearing you say, and one of those is this thing about the NVC network having conflicts. And I want to highlight that a little bit, although that might be counterintuitive to do, but I would like to highlight that because for me, that really points to how natural it is that when we come into relationship with one another, that there are going to be conflicts. And what I'm hearing you say is preventive work has to do with naturalizing talking about these difficult issues, making it clear that we can have these conversations. And somehow when we've already started speaking to one another, there's more relationship, we can have resilience in that when the actual trigger arises. Is that how you would see it as well?
Yeah, it is. And it's, you know, we need to sort of strengthen the relationships that we have as MVC practitioners, because it's when the relationship is kind of so-so, or there's not much connection, when there is a kind of bit of a disagreement, it's very easy to sit back and disconnect because you're not invested in that relationship. So we're, you know, strengthening relationships is actually an important part of walking towards conflict. So we've got something that we want to nurture, this relationship, and I think the world does need a very strong and connected group of MVC practitioners all around the world. So and we're not quite there yet. We're not there yet by any means, you know, in terms of how we could be. So yeah, I do see it as fundamental, us strengthening our relationships, which is lovely that, you know, you reached out to me and we're building our relationships as well.
Yeah, we've had a bit of interaction before, and that happened during a conflict, and this is why I was able to reach out to you when I needed support. So it's something about leaning into trust that's already established, which happens when we meet each other and are able to hear each other. That's what I remember of interacting with you before this. That's, I think, the only contact I've had with you before this, in fact. What would go into nurturing connection?
Yeah, what could go into nurturing connection? So, I mean, in terms of conflict itself, it's like just being really upfront that, yeah, conflict's going to happen. So, you know, what are we going to do when it happens? So that in itself is a huge step, just normalizing conflict.
Right.
But your question was more about, you know, nurturing connection. So, I mean, and this is something that MVC does super well in terms of creating spaces for people to be heard. Because once they do have a sense of being heard, something softens, and shifts in the relationship.
Yeah.
And it's often a question people ask when, because I co-run a kind of series called Building Restorative Systems, which we developed through the Conflict Transformation Circle with Joe McHale and Sarah Ludford. And people often come and ask us, but how can we do this work restoratively in a kind of top-down hierarchical organization?
Right.
You know, how can we, you know, we can't sort of change those sort of structures overnight. So how can we bring some of this into my workplace? So this kind of reminds me a little bit of your question. And, you know, the thing is to increase connection, is to increase communication, have space for empathy, bring in the word empathy, or another word if restorative approaches to conflict, you know, isn't going to work in your organization, or it just, you know, gets people scared or whatever. It's finding different ways for people to be heard and different ways to build a little bit of trust.
Yeah.
Find different ways to do things differently other than, you know, a top-down way of doing it. And you know, the creativity is definitely out there. People kind of have creative ideas and can bring in all sorts of modalities into their workplace. So it's yeah, trying to find the way that to bring a slightly different focus in, which isn't going to kind of get people kind of on alert that something unexpected is going to happen, so they stop feeling safe.
So I mean, now I'm hearing two slightly different things. One bit I was hearing was about how incredibly important having structures for looking at conflict are, and how important it is to have systems in place. And we know from experience that that is very, very true. And at the same time, so many of us exist in already hierarchical systems and structures where relationships are based on something different. And I want to ask, how do we balance that? I mean, if I'm living in a very hierarchical society, or if I'm working in a very hierarchical organization, or I'm somebody who has less power generally in my social structures or whatever I belong to, how do I live this idea that I can nurture connection in my conversations?
Yeah, so such a great question. I guess, I mean, you specifically said, especially if I am someone who experiences sort of lack of power,
yeah.
In any sort of social hierarchical situations, then getting a stronger sense of my needs mattering feels really important. Anything we can do to kind of nurture self-care, nurture our capacity to listen to myself and to listen to other, it is actually a really radical act.
Yeah.
And maybe I'll just sort of name one of the grassroots projects that I'm involved in.
Yes.
Is that a good time to do that now?
Yeah, absolutely. Examples are good, so please go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I kind of you know, I live in South London. I live in a very kind of mixed neighborhood, and I work with several community organizations to support people to organize. Right. For example, one place that I'm in, there is no community center, and people are desperate for a community space for you know, to gather, for celebrations, for anything. It's kind of outrageous that this doesn't exist. So that's one project that I'm involved in. And what happens is it's very difficult for people to hear each other, and meetings can be very tense and very fraught. And so I kind of put time and energy into accompaniment, so on one level, just being there and supporting things to be heard. And after kind of a few, as well as doing sort of very specific things around conflict and grief, which we did a few years ago, and then after a few years, someone came to me, and because I don't mention the word MVC at all in what I do, you know, and someone said to me, "We want empathy, Kerry, come on, we want empathy. Teach us how to do empathy." Yeah. So there was an amazing kind of invitation, which you know, then I felt empowered to kind of bring in much more kind of explicit things around MVC, because there was the clear request. Yeah. So in terms of kind of where we started with this little piece of the conversation is, when we're suffering through kind of hierarchical systems or systems of inequality, wherever they are, boosting our capacity for empathy is kind of always very supporting, and boosting our sometimes really fragile sense of our needs mattering is, for me, is time really well spent.
The reason I asked you that is that so many of us, well, we know that power is concentrated in the hands of a few people, and especially in the social sector. Most people who come to Living Bridges, for example, would be looking at, well, I mean, it's different layers, of course. Some of us are very enthusiastic and some of us are just starting out. But it's looking at a whole system of power not exactly being distributed in the way we would like it to be. So that's where that question came from. And what I'm hearing you say is that it's about boosting my capacity for empathy, but also somewhere coming home to the idea that my needs, and at the heart of that me, I really matter. And so my voice matters.
I see that there is an unequal sense of needs mattering in the world.
Yeah.
And in some communities, just the concept of needs is so feels so far away, and so and NVC can come along like a complete gift, and sometimes it's a lot slower than that. This kind of regathering a sense of connection to my needs mattering. There's a lot of hurt and trauma that's there, that's stopping that connection. So it's a kind of very sort of slow, and it's only built slowly and through trust of, and it's not about teaching anything. It's not even about NVC. It's about showing up for people, and so that they feel that you are there when they need help. That is about someone's needs mattering. That that when they need support, that there is someone there. That only with that kind of showing up for people, I think, is there real healing around not mattering. I don't think it's in the words. I think it's in our actions.
It's in our actions and in how we show up for one another. And I guess I'm touched and I'm smiling because I found that one of the strange impacts of poverty, or living in poverty, or living without power for a very long time, is that we forget that we matter, and we forget that we can. Well, it's not even that we forget. It's almost like there's no trust in this idea that I could matter, and so it becomes harder and harder to speak up, and it becomes harder and harder to advocate for my own needs. And this is one of the outcomes of living in poverty. And my experience has been that just showing up and listening has in fact been incredibly transformative, not just to the relationship, but also to, I mean, we really celebrated something that happened in the field where the community said no to us. They said very happily, they said, we don't want this. And we thought that was fantastic because we really want people to be able to say that. Yeah. So I want to ask you about the phrase conflict transformation, because this is different from how conflict is often seen. The popular thing that people study and learn about is conflict resolution, which to me has a different resonance when I hear it from conflict transformation. So what is that difference, and what does it mean to transform a conflict?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, like you, whenever I hear someone describe my work as conflict resolution, I kind of go, oh, because it's so you resolve. You can't resolve so many things. From interpersonal conflicts to kind of centuries-old conflicts. It just feels impossible. It feels like a really kind of trying to fix it. Just doesn't feel real. So I've always preferred the word transforming conflict. And even that, sometimes I think conflicts can be transformed, and even that sometimes feels like too much. So I also like kind of exploring conflict resilience. It's like conflict's going to happen. How can we more resilient? How can we be more resilient in the face of it? Not even, even thinking that we might be able to transform it, but we can be more resilient. So I like that. But conflict transformation is definitely possible, that we are kind of transformed through the experience of meeting the conflict and ourselves within it into an open-hearted place. That I do witness that happening all the time, and it's definitely something to work for and strive for.
Right.
Yeah.
And now I'm really curious about, would you expand on conflict resilience? Because that sounds beautiful. Like, I want to be conflict resilient when I hear you say that.
Yeah, I know, me too.
Sounds very cool and kind of like, yes.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't even know if it's a thing, but I know that within some of the work that I was doing within Extinction Rebellion, the word resilience kind of, and I don't even know, that's definitely not where it came from. I don't know where it came from, but what it means to me is that I'm stronger. I have some resources. I am resourced to meet conflict, and that could be in my own inner kind of resources, or it could be with I have support. I have support people, but I think what I like about resilience is that it talks to kind of relationships, both with myself and with other people. And I think that's the bit that it adds. And also that, so many conflicts just aren't resolvable or transformable. We are sort of stuck with the legacies of so many things, hence why we need so much solidarity and support. So yeah, resilience really lands for me in my being somehow.
I wonder if that sense of feeling of resilience sounds cool as the same as it lands in my being as well. Like it feels stronger, and I guess somewhere the sense I'm getting is that it's almost like letting go of the idea that I have to fix anything. I don't have to come to a point of conclusion. I don't have to have my heart, magically open. I don't have to somehow convince the other to be open to me. There's no point of that I need to get to. It's just that I'm strengthening myself, and possibly we strengthen ourselves together as a community in order to come to that point of being able to hold that separation, or hold that discomfort of not meeting each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the capacity to sort of stand in the fire, if you like, or to even be in the same room as someone that you are in conflict in, can be huge, and can be really helpful to have that capacity, and that's part of resilience.
And I think I'm guessing that I have this memory of me storming out of a room when you said stay in the same room. Remembering storming out of the room when a friend, and this is way back when, but a friend and I were in conflict, and I left the room, and I'm thinking, if I could have just stayed, even in that discomfort, we wouldn't have lost years and years of friendship over that. I mean, we found our way back to each other over a period of time, but just to be with each other, even in that discomfort, would have been very meaningful, actually.
Yeah. And there is a place for, storming out of rooms, because that's what is called for in the moment. That's the resources that were there in the moment. There's definitely it's definitely really helpful. I think this is part of conflict resilience, to take a break and then come back.
Right.
So we're not forcing ourselves to sort of, when we're way overwhelmed in a moment, forcing ourselves to staying there. Definitely kind of with conflict, I think, we need to kind of resource ourselves and then come in and do a bit, and then maybe take a break and then come back for more. It's forcing out, you weren't suggesting this at all, but I really don't advocate sort of forcing ourselves to do things because we think we should, or we think it's the right thing to do to kind of embrace conflict. Then we're just creating another kind of obligation and duty for ourselves to beat ourselves up with, and it's not that either.
automatically brings in something we should do. I think you were picking up on something that I sometimes carry, is that no, I should be able to sit with discomfort, and I forget often with that to be gentler with myself and find ways to build back my resources before I come in. And then I'm in an unnecessary amount of pain. Yeah, so that makes sense to me, and it's a good reminder to me, and I hope to others who are listening as well, about being gentle with ourselves when we do this work.
Yeah.
Speaking of this work, I want to ask you to touch upon your work with restorative justice. This is something that I'm guessing for many people who are listening in would be completely new, so it might be valuable to start just at the very beginning and say a little bit about what it is, and then what is it that you do with it.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, what is restorative justice? So the way I approach it is that it's a way that relationships are restored when there has been rupture, when there has been hurt, and that hurt is acknowledged, and repair is made as well. That's also restored. Communities are restored in restorative justice. So the work that obviously I'm operating in an MVC network, so that's where our kind of restorative system is, and I work to support other people to create restorative systems in their MVC networks and also in other contexts as well. And to do that, we need to create the agreements that we're going to operate with. Otherwise, and I'm leaning really on the work of Dominic Barter and restorative circles here, if we don't create the agreements that we want to consciously operate with, we're going to be operating with the inherited beliefs around conflict, that there is good and bad, that there are people that be punished, that conflict is between two people and not held by community, all of these things that kind of kick in when conflict happens. And we need to consciously create different kinds of agreements, which include things like, what are we going to do when there is a conflict? How are we going to get support, for those who are facilitating conflicts and also for those who are in part of the conflict? Yeah. How are we going to get the most amount of support to people who need it? And how are we going to learn from this conflict as well? So building in kind of learning mechanisms, feedback mechanisms, debrief mechanisms, all of these kind of things also help to shift our kind of perception into more of a restorative paradigm. That it's not a kind of, you'll have one meeting and it will be fixed.
Right.
Or there'll be one process and it will be fixed. Actually, this is so complex. The reason that we have conflicts, and it needs many different layers of support. It needs, basically transformation of our whole culture to be able to walk towards conflict. So a restorative justice for me operates on many different levels. Lots of things are being restored, and there are lots of opportunities to restore things, and it could be just from a little acknowledgement to someone, oh, I really like what you did in that project, or to notice that someone is trying to speak and they haven't been able to speak, and acknowledge and bring them in or whatever. All of these little acts are kind of restorative acts.
Right. Little acts of acknowledgement, little acts of, I guess, appreciation and acknowledging that this is the value that you bring and seeing the other. Something about that.
Yeah. So there's many different levels to restorative justice. I think there's a more of an official version, but I kind of like a really sort of creative and many leveled version of what it is to be restorative.
It's almost like it's not just about one system, but it's about like a culture of restoration, a culture which doesn't penalize or doesn't advocate for fixing. I guess punishment or penalizing somebody is maybe a way to sort of say, okay, you did this one thing and now I've penalized you, so now it's fixed, and it's a transactional kind of thing. But beneath why they did what they did, and and beneath the hurt of what the impact, I mean, there's quite a lot that goes on for both the author and the receiver of that act in that way. Yeah. I want to bring it from the larger cultural thing to what could we do as individuals, because whenever I sort of hint at restorative circles or restorative justice, there's a lot of pushback, because for many people it's quite a lot of it's a huge leap. And even when it's not so huge a leap, and when the idea sounds good, there's this sort of sense of, oh my god, the problem is so big that we're never going to get to that point of actually meeting each other. And I still want to somewhere say that little bits of every little thing that we do has value, just as you said, there's little acts of acknowledgement. So things like that, is there anything that we could start doing as individuals to nurture more resilience in our relationships, and to nurture each other and to care for one another? What would you say to, I don't know, NVC practitioners or social change makers coming to NVC for the first time?
Yeah, so nurturing our capacity to collaborate is really key. And instead of having a restorative circle, we could have a circle of acknowledgement of something that's happened that we have appreciated in the other, again, to build a little bit of trust, because that leap to a restorative circle is huge. But we've got to find ways that the first step is doable for people, and I think that's totally possible. I think sometimes the languaging around it kind of really puts people off. And right. If people think that we've got to recreate a system, it's like, oh my god, that's a lot of work. But actually, no, let's have a conversation where we kind of appreciate or acknowledge something that's working in our organization or whatever, or a team or whatever,
or around a dinner table,
around a dinner table. Yeah. And obviously not stop there, because we are trying to change the culture. So like, we do this one week, what are we going to do next week, and the week after, and the week, how are we going to build on this? So and for you who might be holding this kind of longing inside of you for a restorative culture, how are you going to nurture that longing inside of you? I mean, that is a restorative act in itself, to be with your longing and to appreciate it and validate it and mourn it and draw it and dance it and just kind of be with it. And I do think that the more we can, I have felt kind of very lonely on this journey, and I have been well accompanied by some close colleagues, and still we've felt really like on the edge and the outside, and people kind of looking at us. You're going to ask us to do that scary thing, aren't you, of being vulnerable when we're in conflict? Yeah. I do feel that sometimes with people, that they're kind of, what we stand for is scary for people. So therefore and that's, I totally get that as well. But also I feel a little bit lonely sometimes with it. So I do think it's helpful to kind of be with others who want to be on this journey too. Yeah. And are courageous beings, and know that this is not easy, but let's do it together. And I do have more and more of a growing sense of collectivity about this, and how there are many people who are walking this, and it's great to hook up. It's great to connect around that.
Yeah, I think that that's a beautiful way for us to come to a close in this conversation, because it also ties us back with something you said earlier about how important it is for us to validate what's going on for us, and how that in itself can be a revolutionary, radical thing to be doing. And about normalizing conversations. The more I can be with my own longings, the more I guess normally or more openly I can speak about it, and the more vulnerable I can be, the more likely it is that others are encouraged to speak to what's alive for them as well. Maybe we have little pockets of people talking peace across the world, and maybe that brings in some change.
And I think one other thing that's just come to me as a sort of like a really helpful thing is that I can be the one that says to people to invite feedback for me. So I can say, if I have said or done anything that's had an impact on you, please let me know. I really want to know. It really nurture my relationship with you. So saying that really clearly takes that step towards someone and makes it easier to kind of cross that bridge in a way to walking towards our conflicts.
And it's that kind of value of doing that work for yourself that you're able to put that out there so vulnerably, and to be able to say that, yes, I'd like to hear how my words or my actions impacted you, and I have capacity to hear it.
If you do.
If you do, yes, absolutely. If and when you do.
If and when you do, yeah.
I found that last bit incredibly nurturing to hear personally, because I also want to share that there have been moments where I felt quite lonely and quite alone. And I've had a similar experience of, if I speak a little bit, others show up. If I show up a little bit, there's, at least somebody else I can connect with. And I kept thinking about how it would be if, for anybody being the first person speaking peace in their own communities, and how deeply valuable that work is, and at the same time, how challenging. And just feeling quite tender and grateful for anybody who does take that one step. Yeah. So that brings us to the close of this conversation. Kerry, thank you so much for your time and for this very delightful, easy flowing conversation. I've really enjoyed it. For everybody who's watching, this is Living Bridges Conversation, which is, again, a series of conversations we're having with a bunch of people who are walking the sort of actively living the bridge, or being the bridge, and doing change-making work in different ways. So please stay tuned for more. And this is part of our fundraiser. We've done 13 months of trainings that bring practitioners of nonviolent communication close to people who do social change work, and kind of create a bridge of learning. And we'd like to keep doing this work. So please support us with money, or by telling other people to give us money. Thank you. No, but it would be, just to make that a little gentler, any amount, big or small, really helps. It definitely helps. So I just want to throw that in there, and thank you for being here.